threat modeling stuff is what I'm going to be talking to you about today, and how we fold that into risk, which is kind of the center of what we do, but we do a few other things around that. A show of hands first. How many of you work like in security? Like security is part of your job title? Sort of 5.5. And how many of you in development? Roughly speaking, the rest of you. Okay, that's helpful for pitching it. So, actually, a little bit about me before I waffle on into the content. So, I people say, when did you start in cyber? I started in cyber as a teenager. Some of you might know what that means. So I was a hacker, and not of the ethical variety. And then the best thing that happened to me was getting caught when I was about to take my A levels and got faced with a choice of kind of going the dark side or joining the blue team, joining the light side. Decided to stay straight, and then went into sort of software development for quite a long time. So I've done my time in development, and I feel your pain. And as I was saying to Malcolm earlier, and went on to run projects and stuff, all sort of secure apps, all in the secure space, secure government, and kind of companies that have a particular security thing. And then for the last 5 years, I've been independent, running this business, consulting to different companies, mostly in the cloud, mostly in AWS, but increasingly getting involved with clients who are either hybrid or are dealing with other clouds, multi-cloud and Kubernetes and things like that. So yeah, great to be teaming up with Control Plane on that front, and just being able to be here and speak at your event. Thank you very much. So a bit of context about security. None of you will be surprised to hear me say that security is hard. Security is hard, and it's getting harder. Often when we build a system, or we come in and we're trying to do the security for a system or for a business, often, or for a business process, we want it to be like the picture on the left, where it's nice and clean and all our ducks are lined up in a row, and we have nice clean processes, and our traffic is where it's going to be, and we know what the risks are, and we know what the threats are, and they're all kept under control. And often it's more like on the right, where we have legacy systems. We have like projects where the business tried to move into the cloud, and then they had to back out, and maybe they've got some hybrid stuff they can't really get rid of, and we've got legacy technology, we've got old processes, we've got some challenging stuff around security, risks that won't go away, and so on. And when I did a presentation not long ago to a load of folk in the banking industry, where I pulled up a thing called DVI. I don't know if you've heard of the Developer Velocity Index. It was something that McKinsey came up with, which is like a measure of the speed of development, essentially. And they had a sector by sector breakdown, of which banking was one of the higher ones, where the pace of development it was basically increasing. So while we're trying to secure the systems that we've got in front of us today, and companies are operating today, managing the risks that we have today, apps are already being built for tomorrow, and they're being built faster and faster. And obviously cloud and SaaS, IaaS, PaaS, and all the other things around us enable that to be happening at a higher and higher speed, and by a wider and wider variety of people and disciplines. So the challenge is kind of not static at all. These two graphs. So the graph on the left is breach costs. So it's average cost in millions of a data breach. And I should have pulled out a different graph, actually. IBM published a report not long ago talking about the average cost of a data breach, again broken down by sector, where it had a much more clear trajectory upwards. And on the right, you've got global cyber spending. Now, this is taken from a research outfit, and obviously all stats can be twisted, so I'm not going to lean on these stats too much, but there's a clear trajectory there, useful for seeing trends. And you can see that cyber spending is exploding, and yet we're not really yet getting on top of, in this case, breach costs. Obviously, breaches are only one kind of security incident, but I think it goes to show that from my experience and from where I'm standing, we're not quite hitting the nail on the head yet as an industry. We're doing some great things. We've got some great tools, and we just need to find the formula that starts to turn the tables on the attackers a bit more, I think. And this is one of the problems why. One of the reasons why is ThreatPlane has a variety of customers, some of whom are really small and some of whom are really large. When we walk into the larger customers and I say, so tell me about your tech stack today, I get presented with a diagram that looks a bit like this. Some of you might recognize this. I've just pulled this off the CNCF website. This is their landscape. But I kid you not, I had a client, now a client who I know very well. And when I first started working with them, their diagram was at least as complicated as this. And it had like a nice figure of 8 kind of process of how they managed their SDLC and stuff. But there were so many tools, and they were just security tools. I mean, this is CNCF, this is the whole landscape, but they had just security tools, and they were struggling with security. So one of the issues we've got is just a plethora of tools that the buyers, I think, don't always understand how to leverage properly. It's not that the tools aren't good, it's that the complexity of the task means that leveraging them properly is bad. On the other end of the scale, we have this. So some of our customers are startups who are pre-revenue. They are building their app, and they don't have the foggiest about security, and they don't mind admitting it. And they just don't know where to start because, again, there are numerous risks. They just don't know where to start. So all of which is to say that I think we've got a challenge, and ThreatPlane is kind of here to try and address this challenge, which is how we divvy up security and how we align security. So on the left, we have a technology-focused security story, which I think ultimately leads to this. Now, we all know that cybersecurity is about technology ultimately. I'm not trying to deny that, by the way, but it's the internet after all. But there is inevitably a business aspect. The risks that we're talking about, the data that we're talking about, the customers, the employees, the other stakeholders we're talking about ultimately are interacting with a business or with an organization. And on the right, the business cares about business outcomes. So what I find in my experience, and I dare say some of you will agree, that you have two units in the business. You have the wider business, which is trying to go in a particular direction. It's chasing the market, it's chasing its customers, it's trying to build features, it's doing what the investors say, whatever else. And you have a security team who is also trying to, batten down the hatches, is trying to react to things as they come along. They're usually communicated at the last minute, all these challenges, and you end up with paths that are just divergent. And you end up with teams that in the longer term are working against each other, and it creates unnecessary tension. And it creates, even down to the language that we use can be a barrier because the business doesn't understand what we're talking about, and we don't understand necessarily what the business is talking about because we are kind of worlds apart. And obviously, the follow-on diagram is to try and unify the two, to try and unify the arrows. And you'll notice that I've drawn the security arrow as a bit more divergent than the business one. And I think this is well, there'll be Q&A after. You can quiz me and challenge me on this. But I believe probably that we've got more of a job in security to do to follow where the business is going, however challenging that might be, to help them understand the value that we bring to the table ultimately, and to help them protect against the risks that they suffer from. So this slide just summarizes all the stuff I've just said, really. So I think that the industry is moving and needs to move from a technology focused to a risk focused. And in some corners of the industry, that's quite a new concept. For some of you, that might be old hat. You've been doing that for years. I'm finding a mix of the two. So this is where I think we need to go to try and really make security more effective for the businesses that we work in and for. And that then allows them to make the right decisions to then gain the upper hand on the attackers. And into this, we talk about threat modeling. So threat modeling is not new. That's the first thing to say, is that threat modeling has been around for quite a long time. It was, the man who wrote the book on threat modeling is a guy called Adam Shostak, who used to work for Microsoft, who's written a brilliant book called Threat Modeling, on threat modeling. And if you're interested in this topic, I can give you a link after and stuff like that. And threat modeling is, as I interpret it and as we use it now when we do threat modeling for customers, is as a communication and a collaboration tool primarily. So what we're trying to do is discover I mean, threats, but really what we're trying to discover is risks, as you'll see in a minute. Communicate those in a standard and understandable way to other stakeholders, um, and collaborate with them to then address those risks. Easier said than done. And there are three kind of big ingredients that make up threat models: threats and controls. Threats being the things that obviously face your system, your attack surface, and the things that your threat actor may do. Controls that may mitigate the risk of those threats occurring or may enable you to detect them, that sort of thing. And in the middle, the unifying factor is risk. And what we find is that even with companies that have already done threat modeling, is that risk tends to be the missing variable. I was involved in a large cloud transformation program before ThreatPlane moved into threat modeling, and the threat modeling, big part of their governance process. We did some huge threat models, some real monsters. And I could immediately see the value. I was new to it at the time. I could immediately see the value of, yeah, this approach works. But we ended up without if you imagine this slide without the risk piece in the middle, we had a load of technical stuff on the left about what attackers could do, and we had a load of technical stuff on the right about what we should do to prevent it. So we had a huge list of threats, sorry, a huge list of controls, very large list of controls, because it was a large system, and not enough budget to do all the work they needed doing. So how do we prioritize? Well, to prioritize, we need to talk to the people who are making decisions, who have the budgets. What do they understand? Not the language of threats and controls, which is where risk comes in, where it needs to come in. And nowadays, where do we use threat models? Where can you use threat models? Wherever there's risk, wherever the security gremlins lie. Some of you are nodding, so this won't be new at all. You can threat model a new system, you can threat model an existing system, you can do it in its entirety, or you can just zoom in on a particular part, threat model that, and then work iteratively to work out your coverage of threat modeling coverage to an entire system. Works very well with agile workflows. And what we're also seeing is opportunities to threat model things that aren't technical. So threat modeling a business process, threat modeling processes where you're sending data perhaps between other partners and third parties. I have yet to threat model an LLM, but I'm waiting for our first gig doing that, because there are obviously some interesting threats around large language models and AI in general in particular. So threat models to me are really versatile because they can be used in such a flexible way. And we've done a load of work with development teams of many sizes in all of these different contexts, where we are either doing greenfield or brownfield stuff, where we're either zooming in on particular features against a larger system that's in situ, or we're doing a full ground up assessment. And sometimes it's apps, sometimes it's platforms, and so on. So I'm, as you can tell, quite enthusiastic about this. The other thing about threat models is just the way that they can unify other stuff together. So with, in organizations where there are strong compliance requirements, obviously you usually have a compliance team that's helping the organization address that. If you're in a bank or a healthcare organization, are our two kind of main examples where there are some compliance things to get done. And what we've tended to find is that threat modeling actually really helps bridge the gap between the compliance team and who are working in the business and your technical folk who are running and building infrastructure and building applications, because you can, again, where we phrase it in terms of business risks, it just allows for a common language, and it just means that the output of the threat model is actually understandable to these teams. And where you can get to is a point where actually the threat model becomes the part of the compliance process, and you don't have lots of ad hoc meetings having to satisfy compliance folk about stuff that you've already done, about Terraform code you've already written to handle whatever controls. So yeah, it kind of is useful as a corpus of knowledge to feed into other processes. It usually doesn't fully to address compliance requirements, but it does, in my experience, go a fair way to helping grease the wheels there. I've already talked about their flexibility. They're flexible to produce, and they can evolve as the systems evolve. So when we do threat models, we'll advise that you try and keep them up to date. So I'm going to delve a little bit into threat models. I don't think we've got time to actually do one together. I've based this presentation on a workshop that I do with another group regularly, and we do actually delve into like a WordPress and sort of do some threat modeling together. We haven't quite got time for that, but I mean, if you're interested, I'll link you to that book later. But you can come and chat to me after. We do a load of stuff with some customers around training engineering teams to leverage threat modeling to like harness it for their own use. So if you're interested in any of that stuff and just how to approach threat modeling, then I'm very happy to. I mean, you won't shut me up, so sorry. The basic components of a threat model are this: you obviously scope out your system, so what you're going to threat model. Really important to get this right. So important to get this right. Um, the number of times we'll have a threat model, but the scope will be unclear, which means we know exactly what the risks are. We just don't know what the system is, so we have no idea whether actually we need to reassess any of it. Like I've encountered that scenario so many times, and it unfortunately really saps the whole thing of value. So really important to define your scope, whatever it is. We usually work with just AWS architecture diagrams as my usual scope, and that is usually sufficient. And then threats and controls. And then, as you saw, you can also include risk, which we always do, and particularly business risks. So we'll always phrase risk in terms of business risk because I think that's how you need to do it. But you can also include all this other stuff. So we're doing some work with one customer at the moment to integrate our threat modeling into NIST 853. It's natural that when you put controls on a threat model, you then track what the status of those controls are. So it's pretty standard practice to, you'll list out, say, for example, you have an attacker who, so you have a threat that an attacker could change a file in an S3 bucket. So a natural control for that would be, let's put a policy on that bucket to stop the attacker doing that. So you might then link to a ticket, which is create an IAM policy, stick it on the bucket, you just track it in a ticket. So it's natural to follow that stuff with control status, and it obviously becomes very easy then to derive risk from that. We've also got some customers who are exploring linking it up with CTI, so threat intel, with inherent residual risk positions, and then with use cases, which is a big one for us. So when I say use cases, I mean monitoring and alerting. Really, really important and often missed in things like threat modeling exercises is that the exercise is not just a preventative exercise. So if you have a system with a whole load of threats against it, you will probably never be able to fully prevent all of those threats from occurring. And of course, the threat landscape is moving all the time. So kind of by definition, you won't be able to prevent it all. But just as important is being able to detect an attack occurring in the first place, whether or not you've sufficiently mitigated it. So to take that S3 bucket example, an attacker writes a file to an S3 bucket, we may have a preventative control in there that prevents that, but we'll still advise the client to put, if the risk justifies it, put some kind of alert in there for it anyway, just in case the control fails. So we do a lot of stuff with that. And the real power of threat modeling, I think this is the, you want threat modeling manifesto, this is it, this slide here. Well, I mean, it could be touched up a bit, right? But where you really want to get to, where a CIO or a CISO wants to get to is, where is my risk? What they want to know is, I've got a limited security budget, how do I deploy it? I've got limited risks which I need to communicate to my board, where are they? And we've got a vendor saying to us, they've got this solution, how many things can I knock off with that solution? And for that, I think the real power of threat modeling comes with being able to step back and look at your whole technology estate, whether it's AWS and custom apps, or whether it's just like a SAP system or or whatever, deployment or whatever, and being able to say, right, this is where these are where our risks go to. And remember, this stuff is rooted in business risks. This is not this is not just about technology tools flagging up technology risks, which may or may not relate directly to the business. This is about business risk, stuff that resonates immediately with with senior people in the business, because this is also the stuff that they care about. So this is, I think, the real power of threat modeling, and this is kind of what we're working towards with our customers. So with some of them we've done tens and tens of threat models, and they're now in a position where they can get that picture, where they can start to make actually quite strategic decisions about security in knowledge of the facts around risk. So I'm going to step through the process a little bit with what time I have left, and just talk about how we create one. There's loads more resources I can point you to afterwards, but threat modeling comes in a few varieties. if you follow him at all and you've heard of Adam Shostak and you follow him, you may well have heard him say that you can threat model in as little as 5 minutes, which is absolutely true. So when I say book a 60, 90-minute session to start, what we tend to find with our typical engagement is, you've got a team who's already built or at least already designed a system of some sort, and they're trying to figure out, how are we doing? Like, have we got any big gaps? So it usually needs a bit of time just to sit down with them, work out what it is, what they're trying to do, and what controls they've already got in place. So we usually say, bring in some technical folk, some engineering folk, bring in a threat modeler, someone to just mainly facilitate the discussion, and drive it towards the right things that matter. And then ideally you'd have business users there as well, because they understand the business risks aspects. You can do it asynchronously, but it's much easier done in the room. Becomes really important where you're dealing with data, for example, being sent between users or sent to third parties, where the business risk aspects are usually fairly opaque when you're developing the system, but can be very apparent to the business users. So here is my 6-step process for creating a threat model. These slides, I think we can share them all afterwards. I think, can't we, Sam? So don't feel you have to copy all this down. I can share all this afterwards. So 6 steps. Number 1 is scope, as I said already, really important to handle your scope. Just get a good handle on whatever it is that you're threat modeling, and importantly, what's out of scope. And our kind of watchword, my kind of watchword, because my brain is of limited size mainly, as simple as possible and as complex as necessary. So start with blobs in a box. And if you really have to, start including some of the color and some of the detail of what you've built. But we stray away from that as much as possible unless it becomes relevant to the risks or relevant to the threat model itself. And then number 2 is to explore data. So particularly what data you're handling, if any. With some systems, it's just about compute. It's just about providing a service. There's not really any data that we need to worry about. But in the main, you're handling some kind of data that you just need to be careful of. It's got some kind of implication if it gets changed without your knowledge, or if it gets breached. And then third, the kind of the sort of threat actor, and really we're talking about not specifically is it APT28 or the APT29. What we're talking about is the sophistication level of your adversary. How motivated are they going to be to attack your system, if at all? And who are they? Are they nation state, organized crime, insiders? Are they accidental insiders, which is an increasingly, I was going to say popular one, it's an increasingly common one, where users, make mistakes, and that leads to a security incident. We try to include that in our threat modeling as well. And then the last 4 steps are just about working through the process for the threat model itself. So we brainstorm our threats using Stride, and I'll talk about Stride in a minute. And then separately to those, we come up with controls, and there's a degree of separation, which is really important there. And then we repeat. So what we tend to do with the repetition is we always say to clients, roughly refresh your threat models every 3 months, or every 6 months, or when your system changes, and it usually lands on roughly every 3 months for some of the ones we've been dealing with recently anyway. Ideally, when you repeat a threat modeling exercise, it's actually fairly low effort. That's the idea. So if the system hasn't changed, then it's actually quite low effort. But it is important you go through that so you can detect changes. So Stride is a categorization method. Who's heard of Stride? Some of you, surely. Yeah, most of you. Okay. So for most of you, this won't be new. So Stride is a way of categorizing attacks, and I think there's a debate out there about whether it categorizes every kind of attack. In my experience, it sort of does if you're a little bit creative with the words, but it's a really helpful guide just for making sure you covered all the key vectors of attack on a particular component in a system or a particular user in a system. So spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. So spoofing is about spoofing someone, i.e. stealing an identity, so pretending to be someone else, or pretending to be another machine, or pretending to be another IAM role, something like that. If the domain includes it, we'd extend that to include things like phishing attacks, some social engineering attacks, that sort of thing. Tampering is tampering with information, so either on the wire or at rest. An attacker goes and changes your database underneath you, goes and writes to your S3 bucket outside of your application. What do you do? Nicks your USB stick, changes all your files and then puts it back in without you knowing. What do you do? Repudiation is an interesting one. It's all about auditing, logging. So repudiation is strictly defined as the ability for an attacker, for the ability for someone to do something and then claim they haven't, or for someone to not do something and then claim they have. But we extend that usually to include attacks on our logging and auditing systems, logging and auditing process. Information disclosure, as the name would suggest, is a breach of confidential information. So where an attacker can read information that they shouldn't have access to, which may not just be PII. Of course, it might be an attacker can do a recon on your system and work out where your open ports are and things like that. Denial of service is any denial or degradation of service which might pose a business risk. And elevation of privilege, which Adam Shostak lovingly calls the queen of threats, the queen of stride categories, tends to always have a high level of risk attached to it, and is usually associated with someone gaining an elevated privilege through vulnerability or misconfiguration, and then being able to conduct most of the other categories of attack because of their elevated privileges. So elevation of privilege is usually a hot one for most threat models. So those are on the threat side, and what we do when we threat model is we just iterate through all the components in the model, focusing on those ones which we know are most relevant to the business risks we've got in front of us. And we iterate through the applicable stride categories. And every component in the model, again, I apologize that I haven't got a diagram in front of. Actually, I lie. Actually, we do have. If I hit stop here. I do have a dummy diagram, which I used here. Yeah, brilliant. Okay. So, for example, if we took this scope, we would iterate through all of the items in this diagram here on the right. And typically in a threat model, all of your items in your diagram fall into 4 categories. So you have actors, users typically. You have a process, which is any kind of process. So it could be an application server, but it could be just anything which is taking an input, providing an output, and/or. So it could be a batch job, it could be a script, it could be part of your business process where just some data is being transformed. So that is a process. It's operating on something. You have a data store, so anything which stores data, fairly self-explanatory databases, S3 buckets, file shares, that sort of thing. And then the arrows are data flows. And those are your 4 categories of things in data model, in your threat model, sorry. So from there, you can, even without knowing all the details about tech stack underneath, you can start to reason about, right, where are the risks going to be? What sort of threat would the attacker pose? What sort of controls would be put in place? It's not my alarm, is it? Fair enough. So when we're building a threat model, we sort of iterate through those components one by one, and we build a table of threats. And let's go back to the beginning, isn't it? And after that, we move to controls. And controls are just a way of, as I said before, mitigating your threats. So typically, for every threat, you would have the threat the attacker does X, it impersonates an actor. Here's the stride category. Here's the component of the system we found it against, and then we would list a set of controls that we could put in place, and it's could is the key word at this point. It's a shopping list of controls that we could do to mitigate that threat occurring or mitigate its damage. So quite a lot of our work is done in blast radius management, and quite a lot of the controls, therefore, we focus on are finding and reducing that blast radius. But there's also detection, which is really important. So if you find any threats where there is a high degree of risk, we always are looking for how can we detect that in the first place. Sometimes really hard to do, particularly at the application level, and work with that, and then also response. So some of you may well have worked with responsive controls, self-healing systems, that sort of thing. That might be where we think about this sort of thing, but most of the time we're going to be aiming for preventative controls if we can. And the beauty of controls is that it's a blank canvas. So if we have a risk given rise to by a threat, the controls is our collective, remember we've got engineers, a threat modeler, and business users in the room. We can think of anything we can think of to reduce that risk, whether it's to detect, prevent, or to just merely to reduce the blast radius by mitigating it. And it's easy to move to technical only controls at this point, to think immediately about configuring cloud resources to do something stupid, something clever but perhaps stupid. to think about technical, fairly elaborate technical solutions to a problem, when sometimes actually there's a simple thing you can do in the business to make sure the data that isn't there in the first place or anything like that. So the controls are a blank canvas; they don't have to be technical. Oh yeah, and one other thing is at the bottom here, do try to capture controls already in place as well. So part of threat modeling is communication and collaboration and discovery, as we said, and part of that, the communication piece, is to communicate the security posture we already have. So it's really important just to try and capture how much risk you've already mitigated, because the chances are you've already done a load of work to mitigate risk. As we said before, you could add a load of other stuff into the threat model, but that's kind of all there is. That's all there is to it, really. So a few key principles, and then I'm going to stop talking and let other speaker take the stage. Simplicity is always key in threat models, I find. It is a communications tool, so we want to be really simple and clear in the language you use, and by linking it back to risks, some of that is work done for us, but the way that we scope the threat model, the way that we design it, should be as simple as possible. We are using it to communicate, so it's important to reflect that in the language that we use, and to keep things clear. And then lastly, to keep it up to date. A threat model gets steadily more worthless, and starts to become dangerous after a while, if it's not kept up to date, because it can become a bit of a false sense of security when perhaps things have actually moved on. So I hope that was helpful. I'm sorry that we haven't had a chance to do a practical demo, but I think probably my time is more or less up, I think. So thank you for bearing with me. And all my details are here. Jonny Tyres on LinkedIn. Feel free to just look me up and add me. I'll accept all the connection requests. And yeah, if you're interested, you want to find out more, get in touch with me afterwards. As I say, we do run training for teams who are who are interested in exploring this further. So if you want to talk about any of that, or you just want some pointers on how you want to get started personally, I'm very happy to get you plugged into all that. So thank you very much. That's right. My pleasure.
Let's have a quick hand for Jonny. That was brilliant. We're going to do a quick Q&A if anyone has any questions, because it comes up. There's always questions. So we're just waiting to see if we can get the microphone working. Bear with us one second. Okay, we can start with Q&A. Jonny, if you could just repeat.
Yeah, I'll repeat. Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm quite happy to repeat questions.
We'll try and do it organized. For any immediate questions, we'll go. Gentlemen in front, have to go near, please.
Yeah, first of all, I came in a bit late, but I really like what I saw. Just curious, it's like, I feel like when I hear about tech modeling, there's like a little bit of like talk about formal models, like Tyres, things like that. And the one thing that I keep coming back to is like, how do you actually prioritize these like threats?
Yeah, great question.
How formal is that usually? How much is people like?
Yeah, so the question was around threat models have a lot of detail in them. How do we prioritize the threats? Yeah. I mean, exactly. So this is why we've mixed in business risk. So when we produce a threat model, we link every threat at the end to the outstanding business risk. So we say, right, we've got a threat. We've got a list of threats and different components in our system. The system will have a colorful picture as far as risk goes. Often you'll have some parts where the data is being handled, some parts where actually it's not that important, some parts where it's very important because it's authentication or whatever, and the business risk then becomes your guide to exactly how to so that's as formal as we get. And there are two aspects to it. Number one is how high is the risk, and we have, I mean, every business tends to have their own established methodology for measuring risk. They usually have, if they're old enough, they usually have an impact matrix, which will define this is what a critical risk looks like to us, this is what a medium, this is what a low looks like to us. Or they might have a more comprehensive scoring system. Most of them do not, but some do. But also another aspect of that is risk tolerance. So you might highlight a high risk, fine. But where are we aiming? Are we aiming to get it down to a really low risk, just lower than high, like is a medium all right. So working out what a business's, what they're willing to tolerate in terms of outstanding risk is quite an important factor. And that's usually where kind of, stakeholder engagement, particularly senior folk comes in. And it's why it's quite important to work out exactly what the risk is, so you're very clear on what the answer, what question you're asking in the first place. But yeah, business risk as an overall guide is how you do that. I think without risk there, it becomes very difficult to really prioritize a threat model, because it basically comes down to an argument between different points of view about which threats might be more important, which components might be more important, which controls we should ought to get in anyway because it's cheap to do or whatever. So business risk is firmly the favourite there. So, thank you.
Other questions? Gentleman behind.
Hey. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So the question is around how do we threat model front ends? I mean, it's a fair question. We usually focus on, the back end, and because typically you're submitting data to a back end, you're doing some processing, sending it back. If you've got an application which is purely front end, quite a lot of your controls are by implication outsourced to the browser already. So, if you're using local storage, for example, you're relying on the controls around that local storage, which the browser will enforce for you to make sure that other domains can't access the same local storage. Some of it, I mean, it still has value, I think. So we've done a few threat modeling engagements with that sort of scenario in mind, where most of it is front end based. Some of it gives rises to risk around, maybe you need to train your users more, or you need to make sure that the browser is kept up to date, for example, is an obvious one. Vulnerabilities always play a part in threat models. And an attacker being able to exploit a browser vulnerability in the JavaScript engine or something would be kind of an obvious factor there. I mean, it's fair to say that generally the level of risk is lower, but it all depends on the particulars. You mentioned IP addresses and stuff, for example. Obviously, yeah. Or on the business side. So is your question more whether to include the front end in the threat model in the first place? Is that what you're getting towards? Yeah. I mean, it's a good question, and it applies to other threat models as well, where if when you build up a library of threat models, a similar situation sort of comes together, where if you have different cloud components fitting together to form a larger system, you may threat model one component when you build it, and you may get it right down to like a really low level of risk. And you might go over here and you've got this component here, which is talking to that one. You might actually find that you do the threat modeling exercise to sort of discover the threats. You may then find actually the business risks aren't actually that large because we've already done all the work down here, and that may well apply in a front end scenario as well. So just because we're threat modeling, it's discovery first, do the work for controls afterwards if the risk justifies it. So if you do the threat modeling and you discover actually, as we have done, actually the threat modeling engagement where it was, very front end heavy was exactly this. It was actually, there isn't really much to address here. You could do some controls work, but it won't actually move the needle on risk. We wouldn't recommend you go any further. But you've got the threat model, so you've got the backup to say, you've got the evidence to say, yep, we've done the work. We know that the risk is mitigated. We know what the risks are, and we've got somewhere to start from if we ever need to refresh that. So, talk to me afterwards if you want to go into more detail. But yeah, that would be my sort of general suggestion. Yeah.
We'll go, Michael.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, when you get to a general cloud platform level, so the question was around how do you maintain, a secure controls position, make sure the controls don't fail, maintain a secure configuration. Um, I, I mean, at a yeah, I mean, as I said before, we would encourage detective controls where you can for where the risk justifies it. So we try to minimize detections as much as possible. Security teams already get enough noise, so we only ever sort of ask customers to put in detective stuff for stuff that really matters. But those scenarios are partly that because also, of course, an attacker may go after your controls. If they elevate privileges or get control of a dev account that can change an S3 bucket policy, then they may just remove it and then they can go and cause havoc. Um, I mean, my other recommendations would be, high level platform stuff. So think of things like AWS config, cloud custodian, those sorts of tools where, and there are many more, where you're kind of watching things. I mean, when we've worked with customers where they have larger sort of platforms, larger deployments, we'll usually end up with an umbrella effect of threat models, where you might threat model the application, then you might threat model things like the account that the application sits in to capture like stuff that isn't directly related to the application, but things like the roles you define in the account, maybe the VPCs you've got defined. If you've got a VPN back to the corporate, so that you can do some things that may not strictly fall under another threat model. At the top of that tree, typically you would have like an AWS wide threat model, which is where we look at things like uh, SCPs, like if you've got transit gateway, VPC, those sorts of things. And that would be the level, and like organizational cloud trail, that would be where we're starting to say, right, what if an attacker is, in a general sense, trying to disrupt AWS configuration and controls? That would be and then we'd do the equivalent for the other cloud platforms. Obviously, it's a slightly different challenge when you get on-prem or if you go hybrid, but for the cloud, that's where we'd start.